Hi, it's Jim McCarthy with American Vapor Manufacturers, and we are back with another installment of our Shaping Vaping podcast, which is a regular series that AVM's been doing to talk about the latest developments and happenings in the world of nicotine policy and vaping regulations. And today we're going to be talking about another podcast, a much more prominent, visible one, which is now appearing on the Audible platform, called Backfired, the Vaping Wars. And I'm very pleased that we have Joe Gitchell joining us, who is, in my view, one of the smartest, sharpest thinkers on vape policy. But I want to let Joe maybe introduce yourself. You'll do a far better job with your bio than I shall, I think.
Well, thank you, Jim. I would say what you did get correct with that brief introduction was you pronounced my name correctly. The idea that I'm the smartest and sharpest anywhere that's a funny one. What I will say is I am the most fortunate person you will ever encounter, and I won't muster all the evidence for that, but just as a starting place, I am as lucky as it all gets out. I work for Penny Associates, have for the last 30 years. We're a small health consulting firm. Started out doing work to expand access to treatments to help people stop smoking. Spent 20 years consulting for GlaxoSmithKline and predecessors, Nicorette, Nicoderm. We spent a year consulting for Enjoy, then about 4.5 years consulting for RJ Reynolds, BAT, on their non-combustible products, and for the last 4.5 years for Juul Labs on their products. And those are important disclosures for people who have the benefit of my perspective on things. I won't bore you with a lot of book recommendations, but hopefully the show notes will allow us to do that. I will, because I am on a mission to promote Braver Angels. And if folks don't know what that is, please Google Braver Angels. It's just good for all of us. And then I'll have some other ones in there. And I won't give you the full blah, blah, but I have spent a lot of time over the last decade or so trying to understand how people change their minds and what allows that to happen or can. And I had an experience this morning that just hit me. So in the office in Bethesda, I would bring my 2 dogs in, and it seemed to be fine. Nobody, whatever. But I also didn't notice any other dogs being brought into the office. And about a month ago, the security guard was like, "Have you seen the memo?" And I was like, about your dogs? And I was like, "No." And a little defensive, like, what? And I was like, "But no, I will check it out." Well, turns out the lease we had signed had a very unambiguous, like, service animals only, don't be blah, 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 blah. So, I don't love it, like being able to bring my dogs, but can't do it. I went up to her this morning and said, "I wanted to thank you for letting me know about the dog policy." And she was like, absolutely, I'm glad it was helpful. And I still found myself wanting to defend what I had done. Like, well, I didn't know that I couldn't do it, or, because of the... And this is about bringing my dogs into the office. And there were, so the idea that people that have spent decades of their lives and all this energy and all this emotion, that it is anything other than asking for transformational change to think that we're going to see shifts. It was so stunning to me that how I felt myself wanting to somehow, well, I can shape this in a way that doesn't make me look like a rule breaker, and this was nothing. So with that as context, let's go.
Well, it's a good start. You're reminding me of my times in the confessional booth in your nearby parish of Blessed Sacrament, in which you'd hear something very similar. You're giving the secular version, but Monsignor gave me the New Testament version of that. So let's go into this with mea culpa, open hearts, and try to move closer toward the light, is what I hear you saying. We're here to talk about the big splashy new podcast, which is getting a lot of attention. And again, it's called Backfired, the Vaping Wars. The hosts are veteran journalists Leon Nafak and Ariel Partis, who've written for a wide variety of top-tier publications. And they've done other podcasts themselves, which have been, very widely widely listened to and highly regarded. So they're both media pros. And it's getting a lot of publicity. They've clearly got a lot of production behind it, and it's very well put together. It's a 9-part series, runs about 8 hours in total length, and I'd certainly urge everyone in the vape community and beyond to give it a listen. But that said, Joe, I've been following closely the reaction among our closest stakeholders in the vape community, and the sense I get is that the reaction is very mixed, and that's certainly my own take on it too. There's a long thread which we'll put in the comments that people can look about our critique of it, and I'm torn because on the one hand, they're shining an important and highly visible light on an issue that we both care so much about, which is that nicotine vaping is helping countless Americans and people around the world to quit smoking, the single biggest public health challenge that there is. But on the other hand, it's all viewed, I think, through a pejorative lens, which is very caustic toward the industry, regards nicotine in a pathological way. And I thought, kind of, to my surprise, for all the good, deep reporting in the piece, it seemed to just skate past so many glaring examples of institutional malfeasance on the issue, as if they were just happenstance or par for the course. So why don't I pause there and get your thoughts? Because as you can tell, I'm a little agonized about how to get at it.
Well, one, I think it is the mark of a podcast that I suspect the completion rate on that. I'd be fascinated to know what is the for an 8-hour run of the people that listen to the first episode, how many get through the end. The point is, we're talking about it, and it has had its effect of bringing some new information, bringing new analysis into a much broader space, and I guess I was hopeful. I didn't expect it to change the world, but I could have been disappointed. I was not disappointed in terms of it as a product of professional journalism. What I did take from that, and I think I may have mentioned this to you, when Leon Nafak was doing, I think, NPR Planet Money, so did an episode talking about the podcast. Toward the end, and I'm paraphrasing, but hopefully it's correct, he made the observation in terms of the uncertainty in this space, and said, we really don't have that much information about people being exposed to just nicotine alone at high levels for long periods of time. Now, that's literally true if we're talking inhaled, but it's not at all true if we're talking about high levels of nicotine delivered over long periods of time. And so what sunk in to me was that even a guy who is as personally and professionally motivated to gather all the information and processes and deal with it, and with access to anyone, he talked to so many people, that he had not heard the Swedish story or processed that, and essentially all of VapeFam could have given him 4 citations on here's things that we should know. So we do have, and a lot of times with health and information and misinformation, it's not an information deficit. that's not the fundamental problem. It's not that people don't know things. It's just the way they process what they know and give it meaning. I think we do have quite an information deficit issue here. And the fact that even a team that worked that hard didn't know this, we actually do know quite a bit about exposure to nicotine alone at very high levels over a long period of time. And while not benign, it's a very different profile than cigarette smoking. And it did provoke me to want to grant grace to the other reporters who didn't have a year's worth and all this effort and are expected to do a fair and credible job with short filing deadlines.
Well, you're a more gracious person in that regard than I am, Joe. As I've been watching the publicity that they've been getting, and again, kudos to them as a PR guy. I applaud their hustle and chops and getting that spotlight on them. But they've been on a number of different cable programs, NPR. They did MSNBC. I think they're on one of the morning shows too. And again, you see the same characteristics that you're describing. These kind of surface level, inch deep, reflexive questions. Not from them necessarily. I mean, they're clearly more informed. But the point I'm making is that the journalists and the national commentators that are talking about this crucially important subject have only the most superficial, instinctive, reflexive level of understanding. And yet those are the people that the American public's relying on to be informed. They're the ones that lawmakers and others are pointing to say, we must do something about this. And yet we're being, the whole issue is being steered in a direction by people that have a barely Crayola level understanding of the topic.
Well, so here, let's bring this to this week, right? The New York Times did a piece on quitting vaping.
I saw that,
right?
Yeah.
And Washington Post was that just yesterday on generational nicotine-free bans and that sort of stuff. And I have not read them carefully, but I've read them, and I think they're like brief whiffs of the notion of a continuum of risk, but they are fleeting and faint.
Yeah.
And if that's our reality. These are leading trusted news sources that do not know the continuum of risk, and if they do, they don't accept it. And
it's horrendous. I mean, the New York Times is the largest paper in the country.
It's where we are. It's where we are. Is it horrendous?
We can still lament it. I mean, that's something that ought to be, fixed or objected to or improved. I mean, I guess a better way to get at this that may appeal more to your approach, Joe, is the importance of dialogue. I think that you and I agree that having an open, robust, far-ranging discussion about this crucial public policy issue is essential, not only to understanding, but into building consensus and finding sensible policies and all the other virtues that come with, free-spirited, open debate. But we have a hard time doing that with the very journalists that we're talking about. We reached out to both NAFAC and Partis and invited them to have an open conversation. We said so in the thread that we did critiquing their podcast. I tried hard to be as measured and good faith as I could be in our thoughts about their show. And the invitation, I hasten to add, also promised that we would have a civil conversation about it, which we have done with many, many people on this same Shaping Vaping podcast, even those we don't see eye to eye to. And they declined, said flat no, and said they didn't wish to, have an argument about it. And so, that's a characteristic, I should add, too, of virtually all the other journalists that we've tried to engage with on this subject at all these major leading outlets, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNN, NPR, on and on, even with designated personnel at those outlets, the ombuds people whose whole job is to dialogue with stakeholders. They too hung up on us. And I guess I'd ask you, why do you think that's happening? I mean, it's one thing for them to have a sort of shallow understanding of the issue, but the intransigence and unwillingness to have a dialogue with the people that they're covering really is really striking to me, and I struggle to understand, the reasons for that.
So, one, and I'm not trying, though I seem to be succeeding at being your rebuttal person, but not to disagree with everything you're saying, but almost everything. One, if I saw the exchange correctly, Leon, he thoughtfully replied to your invitation.
Yeah.
He said it seemed like you were looking more for an opinion commentary. We stand by our reporting, something like that.
Right.
And he gave you the respect and decency of a response, which I think,
Yes.
well, the bare minimum, you don't get the bare minimum most of the time, is my understanding.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
So I think, let's have a continuum of responsiveness and engagement if we can not be, let's reject the binary to get all Amanda Ripley. There's another book.
Okay.
Damn it. Sorry.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, I got a pat on the head instead of a kick in the shins. You're right.
So so then the question is, what is left for you, AVM, to do to try to spark the kind of discussion and engagement that is needed? And the problem is the folks on the other side clearly don't think it's needed. So you don't have a shared interest or set of sense of this situation.
Well, I think the answer is found even in their own podcast. All throughout the 9 episodes, you see how public policy is being shaped in a way that impacts 10 plus million Americans who are vaping, not even counting their families and their spouses and their children, et cetera. So it's a huge segment of the population. And those people are never included at any step of the conversation. The congressional hearings don't include them. The journalists never interview them. The FDA never dialogues with them. They weren't given a seat at the table at the White House conference that the podcast zeroed in on. But you know where they were heard? You know what did make a difference? When thousands of them gathered on the ellipse south of the White House when the Trump administration was fixing to put those new regs in place, and they brought signs and they brought bullhorns and they raised their voice. And the answer, I think, to your question is in that example right there. The vape community is and ought to be speaking up and speaking out and have this conversation with ourselves. And if we have to confront all these various institutional voices and say, hey, you're excluding us. Hey, we think you're wrong. Hey, we deserve to have a voice here. That in and of itself, that kind of collective expression, I think, has a huge public policy impact that can't be erased.
I agree with you. Where I would augment is to say, while you framed your setup carefully to say so much of the public policy development has excluded the people who it impacts the most, I would say Backfired worked pretty hard to get that perspective included, starting with the host himself.
Yeah, right.
And the Mark Sliss story was as real as it gets.
Just to recap for our listeners, the host of the show, Leon Nafak.
They gotta listen to the podcast and give it a review and promote it. But to recap, to further the tantalization.
Well, just to point out what Joe's referring to is that the host of the show, Leon Nafak, is a former cigarette smoker who switched to vaping, and talks extensively about his experience having done so in the show. And they also interview one of our heroes, Mark Sliss, a vape shop owner from northern Michigan, who's been working, tirelessly to help people quit cigarettes through vaping.
Former vape
shop owner, and the reason he's a former vape shop owner is because state and federal regulations bankrupted his business, a fact that was not mentioned on the podcast.
Well, we don't
But the
know
point
when
Joe's
they
making,
his formarness is a fairly recent development. That I don't think that's a failure on their part, or I doubt it is. I'm just trying.
fair enough. Fair enough.
Benefit of the doubt here, dude. Benefit of the doubt.
Okay. They may have finished the production before they learned the vape shop closed. But the point Joe's making is that they did include some voices. They also spoke to a British woman, ordinary consumer, who had switched to vaping, and she spoke about her experience too. So it's true that those were included. Yeah.
And this, well, so I mean, fundamentally, let me put a question to you. Would the national dialogue around nicotine and vaping be enhanced if the people who were going to participate actively had a prerequisite of listening to this podcast? If you were going to if you're a legislator and you were going to make a statement or have a hearing or stuff like that, you needed to listen to this podcast first. Would that improve things or not?
I'm not so sure. I really don't think so.
Oh man, so now, okay. Really?
I'm not so sure. The entire show. I mean, look, Joe. The whole. It's better than the the day-to-day coverage. That's horrendous in the mainstream press, and that every scientist and this academic thinker in this specialty says is the number one problem. It's better than that, but that's a super low bar. I mean, the entire podcast series frames nicotine use itself as a pejorative, pathological problem that needs to be eradicated. I mean, I don't think that's a helpful frame.
Well, like that could be, discussions around dependence, addiction, morality, locus of control. Like there is a lot in there, and I agree that was, the burdens that Leon seemed to carry in the discussion with his mother, and that's very real. But from my experience in working with people who smoke who want to quit, that is real. I mean, it's not even when people do have a better sense of relative risk and things like that. Many people don't want to feel like they're beholden to a compound and that they don't have control over what they're doing and it's costing them money and that sort of stuff. So I am stunned that if I can't. So, and this, I'm going to try to channel Monica Guzman book recommendation. Please. I never thought of it that way, because I never thought of it that way. You did not give me the answer I was anticipating. So what would need to be different, or what one or two things would you need to change in the podcast before you would say, Joe, yes, I agree. Anybody, before Dick Durbin, Senator Durbin calls another hearing, he needs to listen to this whole podcast. That would, I'm not saying it would make it better, but at least would be a chance.
I guess, I guess the things that I would answer would be, let's at least frame the public challenge in clear terms. The show never once mentioned, for example, how many Americans have quit cigarettes by vaping. That's a huge central part of the moral calculus that the show itself puts at the center of its discussion. And yet there's no mention of what the actual scale is. Yeah, they talked to Mark Sliss, and they talked to a woman in the UK who had quit, but those are anecdotal examples. The listener could go 8 hours and have no sense of the proportion of this challenge. So there's one example. Yep. Another might be, I guess there were no voices. There was not one single American expert in the field of nicotine science. You and I have been to many a conference at which serious career, dedicated thinkers who've built their entire careers over studying these questions, and not to boost the industry, mind you, but instead to try to help eradicate cigarette smoking, okay? These are conscientious people who share a lot of the same values that the podcast hosts do. They even thank a lot of those folks, if you notice in the show notes, their own podcast. So they did the legwork to talk to those people, and yet inexplicably, none of those American experts are quoted or cited in any way, and I find that flabbergasting. I mean, again, let's just the readers and the public deserves to hear where exactly is, if there's a debate in public health about this, then let's hear about it. Who's on the sides of the debate? But you never hear any description of this broad plurality of expert, authoritative, credentialed academics and scientists and researchers. The prevailing consensus that agrees that nicotine vaping helps people quit smoking and is vastly safer than cigarettes. You never hear that scale. All you hear is there's a debate, and now we're going to introduce you to all the people, on the prohibition side. And so I guess I would say the second part would be, in addition to describing the scale in human terms, also describe the scale in the intellectual space as well.
So it's almost like it wouldn't actually take that much to do like the 7.5 minute prequel of, before you listen to this, these are some what we think are critical elements that may have been omitted that could enhance what you gained from this. You should know that since e-cigarettes have been widely adopted, the rate of smoking cessation has increased substantially. You should know that in the age groups where blah, 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 usually blah, 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 blah. And then people are like, oh, those are literally things. I mean, just 2 hours ago, there's a new paper published by folks at University College London analyzing the U.S. NHANES data, right? Did you see this, the secondhand exposure study?
Yes, I did. Yeah, with the children,
So how much coverage do you think that's going to get? Do you think the American Academy of Pediatrics is going to send a blast to their members saying, you need to know that nicotine exposures are 84% lower among people who vape children than people who smoke children? And remember, you don't think that's going to happen? They're really concerned
they'll zero in on it, but they're not going to put it in the frame that you're describing. What they're going to say is hard proof that vaping exposes kids to nicotine.
So I think this is the term memory hole. What is that? Am I using that correctly?
Yeah. I fight the memory hole a lot. Yeah.
But I think, and I'm fit. I don't have a lot of influence, but I think it's kind of an interesting study. It's federally collected data, and the additional point that, as far as I understand it, kind of that per kind of volume aerosol, cigarette smoke and nicotine and vaping aerosol, the nicotine levels are kind of parallel or similar. So if the nicotine exposure levels are so much lower among the young people, and we know that the other stuff levels between, cigarettes and vaping are so different, that means the exposures of the other things than nicotine that in the vaping aerosol among the secondhand person, like little one, is like trivial. It's homeopathic.
Well, and let me go ahead.
No, it's just the challenge is, how can we provoke the curiosity that gets people to say what is going on here? I need to understand that. Why this isn't that, and this paper is actually a really good example. It's completely independently funded. These are some of the world's leading experts on this stuff. They generate papers like every 6 days. It's federal, U.S. federal data. So it's unimpeachable source. Wrestle with this.
Well, let me ask you a broader question, Joe.
Instead, we're hearing about pouch use from 2022.
Right.
As if and that's proof that and implying that, well, if sales are going up, must be some other group that's buying it if it's not adults.
Well, listen, but notice that that happens also in even the biggest questions in the space. I mean, throughout the Backfired series, you hear discussion about people switching from cigarettes to vaping. Okay, and as you know, as a longtime student and participant in this academic space, there's probably no more important, no more studied question than the rates of efficacy for different smoking cessation methods, nicotine replacement therapy versus pharmaceutical interventions and other kinds of products. Okay, it is they study that with laser beam focus. All right, and yet you rarely ever see any mention of what the studied efficacy is of vaping for quitting. Now, there's a lot of studies out there, and they range in their measurements. There was a big one that got some attention a few weeks ago. You'll recall that said vaping has equal to or better than pharmaceutical and than Chantix.
Yeah.
Okay, which was a very big deal. But almost all of the studies show that nicotine vaping has the highest. I repeat, the highest efficacy of any other method for quitting smoking. I think your guys at Juul submitted as part of their PMTA a study which showed that rate could even exceed 50%. 50%. And so that's a central question. I'm not talking about some esoteric, marginal rabbit hole of scientific data. The Backfired podcast, this was the central question in the entire show. Okay, and yet there was never any mention of what the actual rates are.
Okay, two things. One, they definitely Jamie Hartman Boyce is towards the end, and doesn't she talk about the Cochrane review?
Yes.
So you don't get to say it wasn't mentioned, because the first place you would point to was in the show.
Right.
So
right.
you can retract that comment. Two.
Let me see. Okay. Let me see if I can pull that up. Hang on.
I'm pretty.
Before I issue my full mea culpa. Yeah, let's read that.
I made a mistake. I thought I was wrong.
That's okay. I'm used to being admonished. It says here. This is from the transcript of the podcast.
Yep.
Jamie Hartman Boyce says she's an editor at Cochrane, and we do systemic reviews to evaluate the impacts of healthcare interventions. Hartman Boyce has been leading the Cochrane review of e-cigarettes. She tracks all the research on vaping and interprets the results.
Now it's coming back. This is actually I have high regard for.
Okay, what Hartman Boyce has noticed over the last decade of studying e-cigarettes is that the research on their efficacy has had very little impact on what people believe. What was interesting for me as a researcher in this area, she says, is that the evidence that we had on e-cigarettes for helping people quit smoking was getting stronger and stronger. The evidence that they were probably less harmful than smoking was getting stronger and stronger. And yet public opinion was going in the exact opposite direction. More. I often get portrayed, she says, as being pro e-cigarette. And what I always try to point out is that we're not pro e-cigarette, we're pro evidence. Yeah, she says it's not just ordinary people who are confused. 60% of doctors think that e-cigarettes are just as harmful as smoking. But I have to say, Joe, I do not see, I'll look again and I will stand corrected in the notes if you're right, but I do not see any mention here of the actual, measured efficacy. I mean, she says in a broad sense, it helps people quit, but there's no mention of, well, okay, how effective is it?
So, and we probably don't have time for me to persuade you, but let me just put the marker down. I agree with your broad point. People should understand that what the available evidence is consistent with, particularly if you use these products every day, use them enough, get like them, they can help you switch off of smoking cigarettes.
Imagine you're a smoker and you decided that you want to quit. That's a huge step to make the initiation decision. I wish to quit.
Usually how it happens with vaping, however, which is a whole
Well,
nother
that's
piece
right.
of the puzzle, right?
But that's a great point, and you're touching on a hugely important point: the accidental quitter. Vaping has such a high efficacy that people quit without even intending to. Okay, that doesn't happen, I don't think, with many other cessation methods. But the point I'm making is, when you're a smoker and you're making that decision, one of the questions you as a consumer are obviously going to ask yourself, as you would with any other medication, which one of these various options gives me the best chance of success? I mean, that's a crucial piece of information,
So
and yet you never ever see it.
So you are walking into my house because remember I spent 20 years trying to promote NRT and dealing with the launch of varenicline and Zyban and stuff like that.
I know. Yes.
So
Yes.
I'll try to do this briefly. The tension is that looking at absolute success rates, the 50% reference from the Juul observational studies. The problem is that tells you something. It doesn't tell you as much as you might think it does. And let me give you a proof point. For early studies of nicotine gum, they were getting similar success rates, 40, 50%. Now, why was that? Because they were getting weekly counseling and they were getting, extra support and there were all those sort of things. And it also depends on who is the population in that study. Are they like people with existing smoking disease and you're trying to help them? Are they younger people who aren't as dependent? There are all these factors that let those absolute numbers slosh all around, which is why Cochrane mostly focuses on relative comparisons to some control, either a non-nicotine placebo or an active control like NRT. So and that's where Cochrane says we have high certainty evidence that nicotine-containing vaping products work better than nicotine replacement medications. And whether that's 20 to 10% or 25 to 13, for my part, because it's a tough thing to communicate to people how much these products help. I actually think, and this is another vein, we could do better to explain to people how these products help, which is part of understanding and explaining the role of nicotine from the tobacco plant all the way to in products that people consume. Because people don't there's data show, this is 20 years now, but half the people who smoke thought nicotine patches worked like antabuse or disulfiram for alcohol abuse, that it literally made you physically ill if you smoked while you were wearing a nicotine patch. So that was the mechanism.
I hear you that there are complications and permutations, and that especially for government or institutional purposes, it has to be carefully parsed and phrased. But I'm not so sure it's all that hard. I mean, Vape Shop, our members in our vape shops have that conversation with customers dozens of times on a daily basis. When I talk to my friends who smoke and they ask me for my opinion, I can convey that in kitchen table language that doesn't require, JAMA footnotes. I mean, vaping is the most effective way to quit cigarette. Your chances of succeeding are better with this product than any other. I mean, that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and actually, I'm not disputing the way you express that. It's more when you start saying 50+%. Those are the ones that gives me more.
But that too can be caveated. I mean, if a journalist were examining this, they could say, "Look, there's a range of studies which have looked at the efficacy."
But let's get back to where. Sorry, I took us down a silly hole. But
that's okay. I stepped in the house.
Well, the point was there was a treatment about the what's known about the efficacy and safety of these products from the most credible voice on it, who gave good copy. And if Jamie Hartman Boyce were cited in the New York Times piece on quitting vaping, or this, then we would be in a different setup.
Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. Well, let's move to a different aspect of the show so we don't get further down our rabbit hole. But I want to zero in on the discussion they had about the EVV crisis. And again, I want to praise up top. They dove deeper into how the EVV crisis unfolded within the government institutions at CDC and FDA and the White House, and indeed in journalism, deeper than I've seen in any other coverage. And that's crucial. That was such a momentous, pivotal inflection point for this whole issue. So they deserve praise for looking at that. But I was struck, Joe, at how can I put this? I was struck at how, on the one hand, Juul itself was highly motivated and eager to get to the bottom of it. They tested their own products. They tested the counterfeit products. They understood the impact this would have on their customers and their business. I mean, they moved heaven and earth to get to the bottom of it as quickly as they could. And yet on the institutional side, if you look at what the White House and FDA, I was really astonished. And they have an interview with Ned Sharpless, who was then the acting director of the Food and Drug Administration, and he looked at the scientific analysis, the investigative analysis, and concluded this was not nicotine vaping. This was adulterated THC formulations that were being used in THC products. And he wished to tell the public that, like he wanted to come out and say it. And as the Backfired shows reports, was thwarted in doing so by his colleagues at CDC. And I've got a few more things I want to point out about this, but let me just pause there, because I was so struck at the contrast between what the company did and what the government did.
So let me, I'm sorry, I did not get the chance to do the homework that I wanted to on this, and you had given me enough to want to look at this. So what I recall from the show was that the FDA chemists did their thing, and the commissioner's like, well, we're issuing a press release today. And
right.
I think FDA did. I think they did it over CDC's objections, like it was an FDA press release, not a joint one or stuff like that.
Right.
And it's not surprising that operating divisions within HHS don't always see everything the same way. And when it's a high profile, high drama one, that's not surprising either. Why are you giving me that face?
Well, because drama should play no role in it. The emotion or the drama or what the PTA thinks about it has no relevance to the scientific conclusions.
But
ought to
have the
none.
Scientific conclusion, but to the way that a political organization, which is meaning has tons of civil servants with technical expertise, but is led by political appointees who report up the food chain, they are mindful of all of those bits. So the basic point is, I do think EVV remains what I hope is an unfinished story, as I still believe that it is an opportunity for entities like CDC to grasp victory from the jaws of defeat and to behave in trustworthy ways, which is to be explicit and admit to errors and to fix them, which is what we would hope. It's me bringing my dogs to the office against the rules. I can't,
Well, okay, I would welcome that too, but it's been 5 years now, and CDC still can't bring itself.
Is it ever too late to fix an error?
It's going to have to come with a very big mea culpa, but they might have to visit the Blessed Sacrament confessional before they issue the press release.
Okay, I'll stop traffic. I'll fake a ankle injury. Stop Connecticut.
Yeah, I mean that's the other. Who doesn't have that obligation and who wants to get the news and to the truth right away though is the journalists. And they point out, the Backfired hosts point out in the show that it wasn't just government that wrongly and falsely conflated THC and nicotine vaping as the source of the EVV outbreak. It was also the world of journalism that did so.
Well,
And that
except
played.
for Leafly, right? Except for the cannabis like trade.
Please
stuff,
explain
right?
explain to our listeners the distinction there. That's crucial.
Well, I'll actually let you do it because all I know is that there was a reporter at Leafly who was like on it like months before everybody else, saying like, "Yeah, this is probably driving you."
Leafly is a trade pub. I don't know if it's a trade publication. It covers the cannabis industry broadly. It's a specialty publication. But serious journalists though in that field. And at the time when the EVV outbreak was occurring, Leafly investigative reporters zeroed in on all the sources. They did an investigation on where it came from. They did, if I'm not mistaken, they did chemical analysis and lab analysis, and they even tracked back the source of the product, and they determined in a lengthy, I think it was like a 10,000 word investigative article, the exact forensics of how this had broken out, what the cause was, where it originated, and they were 100% right. And they did that months in advance of CDC and FDA and the New York Times and the Associated Press and the Washington Post, and I could go on and on and on. They were 100% in the right on that. And after that, there ought to have been no possible excuse for any of those other institutions to continue conflating the THC and the nicotine vaping, and yet it persisted nevertheless, and is still going on to this day.
So here's another. I have another. I'm assigning a lot of homework. Hopefully that's okay, Professor McCarthy.
Please.
So a few months ago, I read in the Boston Globe by Kat Rosenfeld or Field.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Who I don't know, but seems like a pistol. On I'd never heard of this guy, Dr. Henry Cotton. So,
yes. Right. Yeah.
I mean, we talked about this. Like the problem is, when we coalesce into groups and don't have the exchange, the kind of dialogue that you were talking about before, how do we break down? The challenge is we are very able to not see the things that we should have. And in that story, the guy who everybody adored and trusted, who believed a theory that mental illness was due to infections in other parts of the body, and that little oops meant that half his patients died in his care because he couldn't cure their mental illness by amputating parts of them. We have lots of examples in the history of science and medicine of where everybody knew something and it was wrong. And the challenge for all of us is we're the same Homo sapiens. Nothing has changed that would give us immunity to that being the case.
I beg to add, what you're describing, I think, generally is what could be called a good faith mistake or an error in analysis. But what happened? What happened here, Joe, in my view, is that the political forces that wish to prohibit nicotine seized on EVV because they knew it would alarm the public, and they knew they could stigmatize nicotine vaping with it, and it would serve as what we in public relations would call agitprop purposes.
Sure.
And that is why they framed it in those terms, and that is why they are so reluctant to set the record straight. So in other words, it's not a good faith mistake; it's willful.
Well, no. I think I would disagree on both counts because I don't believe it. I don't believe it's a good faith mistake. It is a breakdown in the processes that are supposed to keep us from making these kind of mistakes, and those processes are what Jonathan Rauch talks about so nicely in his Constitution of Knowledge and Defense of Truth. More homework, which is, knowledge generation relies upon no appeal to authority. Everything is subject to disconfirmation. And you need to have the back and forth with different viewpoints to know that you're converging on truth, because as good as it feels for everybody in the room to agree with you, that is not an accurate proxy for that opinion being correct. And when you have rooms filled with people who see things all the same way, that error goes up and up and up. And that's not a good faith error, because we know how to prevent it. It's a pain. Nobody likes to have the devil's advocate be encouraged and enabled, and it takes time and blah, 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 blah. And nobody likes to get grief from AVM on Twitter. But if your commitment is to, like, pull a line from Monica Guzman's book, are you prepared to admit that you're wrong about something? And then do you care more about the truth or your beliefs? And if the answer to both of if the first one is yes, I'm prepared to admit I'm wrong, and I care more about the truth, then we can get somewhere.
Joe, but you made a great point a minute ago about how the investigative journalists, yes, working legwork journalists at Leafly, zeroed in on this, did the forensics, analyzed it, came to the conclusion, and that's the ethos that all their colleagues at all the other major news outlets share. We promise to try to tell the truth without fear or favor, objectively, accurately, in order to benefit the public. Okay, and little tiny shoestring budget Leafly did that work, okay, and lived up to that duty to the public. And all the others with a circulation 10,000x theirs to this day have failed to do it. Now, I have to say, I'm sure it does give them, it would give them discomfort. I'm sure it runs counter to what they'd prefer in the policy space or their ideology. But at the end of the day, I don't care. To my mind, that is a betrayal of their own principles and a horrendous disservice to the readers.
Agreed. So what is the golden bridge that you're going to build to let them retreat across and declare victory?
I guess, Joe, I mean, this is where I think you and I may differ on our philosophical journeys. If you're headed toward the tree in India where the Buddha gained enlightenment, I maybe am headed to the bridge in the Lord of the Rings where we fight the giant dragon. I mean, they have to. Their reporting must be discredited. That's the answer. I mean, you look back, there are innumerable stories in the history, in journalism history, in which the press got stories 100% completely and totally wrong. There's one unfolding before our eyes in the national press right now, where the press misled, fell down on the job, was derelict and negligent in their duties. The American public have now realized it, seen it with their own eyes, and are holding journalism accountable for their failures. Now, there's no kumbaya moment there. There's no building a bridge to a harmonic realization. There is a discrediting, and there is a public knock on journalism's credibility. That's how they sober up and come to their senses. And I get that that's combative, and I understand that that's involves conflict. But hell's bells, I mean, the folks on our side of the lines have taken punishment too. Just look in the podcast, in the Backfired podcast, at the sheer agony that Juul employees went through during this time, or Mark Sliss, when people were coming into his shop in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan saying, I read in USA Today that people are dying from vaping. Okay, his business got crushed. Juul got crushed. They got put through a multi-$100 million legal, dunk tank. On and on and on. The harms that were done even to ordinary Americans who were misled about the cause of the crisis suffered too at a population level. So our guys have suffered, have endured knocks too. And if a journalist gets their fur rubbed in the wrong direction because we're pointing it out and discrediting their work, then I have a very, very, very hard time mustering any goodwill for that.
So I'm going to state a proposition and ask if you can generate a counter argument to it.
All right.
I'm quote. You already brought up Buddha. I'm going to quote Lily Tomlin.
Okay, that's close.
Who has said, "Forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past.
Right. Right.
So what's your principled counter argument to forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past?
Well, look, the Catholic altar boy in me is moved by that sentiment, but I have to say, I think it misunderstands the public debate that is unfolding here. All of the public officials in Backfired that were featured, all of the prohibition advocates, and yes, all of the journalists at the major news outlets that are covering this issue day to day share an ideological outlook, which is based on, an ideological commitment that they have. And if they have any contrition or reflection or acceptance of the harm that they've caused, I see zero evidence of it. And I just don't think that's the way that public policy debates unfold. I mean, I wish it were true. I wish that we could members of Congress could hold hands or, come to a realization. But, those days are gone if they were ever here. I mean, that's just not the way I don't think public policy happens. I guess on an interpersonal level, I wish to aspire to Lily Tomlin's vision, and God knows I'd gladly hold hands with a stranger next to me at Mass and say, peace be with you. But I do not think that the reporters at the New York Times or the officials at the Center for Tobacco Products or the zealots at Tobacco Free Kids are ever going to take responsibility for what they've done.
So, and I think this is probably for you and I to gain deeper understandings of our various positions. It's probably a different non-public setting, or maybe a public house, but it may not be being archivally recorded. I do think you should hold, and this is not going to land well, so please. I would.
Buckled up.
Having had the good fortune and have the good fortune to know a lot of these people personally, I don't think the kind of ideologically driven, control-oriented, progressivism, better world because we know better is the driving impetus here. I can absolutely see how it can be perceived as or understood as that. I do not think that's a driving dynamic.
I'm amazed to hear you say that.
I mean, but what I would say is I know these people, you know of these people, you've seen a lot of what they do, and it can definitely fit the profile that you have already existing in your selection set. Your disambiguator. But what I would just, and again, I'm not asking you to believe me and take my word for it. That I'm just asking to at least consider holding more space that isn't the explanation, and these people are not actually as extremist and wrong and devious and menacing and venal as you might think.
Let me make a fine point distinction here. They don't have to be mustache twirling Bond villains in my view. What I'm trying to say is they all share a kind of ideological outlook, which, yes, as you put it, seeks to control and look at the population level. And I think that there's a huge overlap with the progressive outlook for that. I mean, it's no coincidence that all of the leading public officials that were featured in the Backfired program, or all of that progressive Democrat stripe. I mean, interestingly, there's overlap with Mitt Romney, who was also featured in the Backfired segment,
Yep.
but that raises an important question. What does Mitt Romney have in common with progressive Democrats like Keith Ellison or Dick Durbin? Gosh, I know. It's controlling the lives of other people. I mean, don't you see the commonality in that?
So, and I guess this is like the difference between our experiences and the way we look at things, since being of that tribe, it's just
Well, that's
not
a
the
very
way.
interesting point. Let's zero in on that because I think you're making a crucial point here. I think, and one that we've tried to make at AVM is that our THR movement, certainly American vapor manufacturers, try very hard and actually are politically ecumenical within our organization and within our membership, and I'd like to think our customer base too. We have people that run the entire ideological spectrum. And guess what? I think that's fantastic. And most of the other work I do for other clients in other industries, that's not always the case. In the
Yep.
oil and gas sector or energy exploration sector, you are hard pressed to find anyone to the left of Barry Goldwater, in those communities.
Yeah,
But
that's
this
Swiss.
one, right? But this space has a wide, vibrant, full color spectrum of ideologies. And yes, you're right. There's lots of people who would describe themselves as progressive Democrats who share our view. Hell's bells, Joe. There are revolutionary leftists in our movement. I think that's great too. So I don't mean to describe progressives in a pejorative sense, and I don't mean to say that they are all malevolent. Instead, what I'm trying to say is this is the forces that are trying to push prohibition share a kind of specialized ideology that applies to this space, but others too, like food and beverage and lifestyle. And this goes back to the diet wars of the last 30 years, even back to alcohol prohibition. I mean, perhaps it needs a better label, perhaps it needs to be described better, but to my view, in terms of grouping people and the motivations behind their movement, there is a distinct ideological outlook, and I'm telling you, it is pervasive throughout journalism, institutional bureaucracy, and in the legislative branch on that side of the issue.
So, I mean, I don't know, and I don't know like the clear makeup and how to chart it. Obviously, if I did, hopefully
Yeah.
in 1998 we would have made more progress. But
Yeah.
I don't think that the ideological lens is the best focus you're going to get on this stuff. I think so much of this is the history of the efforts to control cigarettes, the lessons learned from that, which were painful and not easy, and at the same time, an increasing polarization of the field, which led to the risk of orthodoxy that is not subject to question, that then must be obeyed and pursued. So and you raise a fair point. There are many, I just saw the efforts to, kick big soda out of sport, as an example of but. And you're like, Joe, are you trying to prove my point? But I just think I don't think it's correct, and I think it's counterproductive because it basically sets it up as an ideological partisan conflict. When, as you say, that's not. I mean, your own point that the AVM community is an ecumenical broad spectrum one, and that's a strength, right? And so
it is, yeah, it is, and I agree with you. It ought not be our primary thrust or the spearhead of our public communications campaign. At the same time, I do think it's crucial that we understand it at a clinical level, and clinical in terms of political machinations and the way that movements and public policy are fought and debated. We must look at that. if only internally. And again, maybe I fear we're going too far down a rabbit hole on it, but I don't know. I mean, I'll put it a converse way to you, Joe. In the Backfired podcast, I was really struck by how throughout the show, all of the various public officials involved, from congressional members to the White House to the FDA and CDC, over and over and over again, you see how these various officials have bungled the process. They wrote bad legislation that couldn't set up proper regulations. The TikTok on how Trump mangled his efforts to ban flavors in certain products but not others. The way that EVV was so horrendous, negligently mishandled. Over and over and over again, you see these public officials absolutely, bungling the public policy, and yet I kept waiting. Excuse me. I kept waiting for some, conclusion. As my English professor would say, what's the therefore? But they never stated the obvious that these are people that are incompetent.
So you're definitely, if you're trying to wrap things up, you're not doing a good job. I'll just say that. Because I basically am prepared to disagree vigorously with all of that.
You don't think Trump messed that up? You don't think Trump bungled it?
So there's so much to this. So I'm reminded, I think it was sophomore year of college, some poli-sci class, and a book called The Irony of Vietnam, The System Worked. And it made the argument that public support aligned with U.S. policy within like hours, essentially. And I think that's what we have here. We have, and again, I'm a lefty squish, and I, think government can be great and all that sort of stuff. I think a imperfect system is dealing with a public that has expectations based on utterly incorrect and wrong information that leads to impossible circumstances for the technical experts, which is execute on the law and the science or make the political public world not want to have you run out of town. That is not a place anybody would want to be. And I think we can agree about that. The way what I think Backfired does, what Backfired does, I would say, to move this along, and I don't have a specific segment or quote, but several times, I think particularly is Ariel, brought up the concept of trade-offs that we need to own, accept, confront, and discuss how much benefit to older people who smoke is worth having, that if they're going to have young people that are going to pick up vaping. And we have to be able to talk about that and not say, I can't believe you just wanted to addict children, which is still where we are. And I think that may be the single most important thing that the podcast does. And I will make a challenge to you. I've not done a systematic review, but of the people who, and you call them prohibitionists, I know that's shorthand for maybe other things. I don't think that's a fair characterization. That's probably not how they describe themselves. But how folks who see the world differently than we do, they're featured substantially in the podcast. I have not seen a social media account associated with those folks boost the podcast.
That's really striking. Why is that, you think?
I have a theory.
Let's hear it.
That you're wrong, I'm right. If more people listen to this podcast, we'd have a better public discussion about how to advance nicotine policy and help people not die early from inhaling smoke in their lungs. And I'm not saying that people who see things differently are trying to avoid that. I think they are trying to save people's lives. I think they want it on the terms that they have laid it out, not on the ones that we are proposing. And that's why they don't want people listening to Backfired, because people who listen to Backfired are going to say, why are we not talking about these trade-offs? Do you have an answer to these trade-offs, Senator so-and-so, Congressman so-or-so?
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. You know, as I was listening to it, I couldn't help but think, for all the legwork and engagement they obviously did with folks on the other side of this issue, those parties must have been looking forward with anticipation to the show, the same way they do to all of their other outreach to national media, expecting, you know, glowing applause and hearty support for their policy goals, and didn't get it. And may have felt disappointment that the show didn't follow the usual, you know, boilerplate blueprint that they, you know, give to other news media.
So is that a story? Is anybody out there who would be like, why would one of the, you know, and I don't know how you measure impressions or stuff like that with podcasts, but if this is something that is reaching people and folks who had strong messages within their own voices over and over again, a chance to say, this is how clever we were, and Krishnamurti and Trumpka, and that, you know, we had this going. Like, why are they not saying, look at how we tried to change public policy, and this has documented it. Why are they not pointing to it?
Yeah, their silence, I think, speaks volumes, and it is consistent with the way that same, you know, broad group. What I won't call them prohibitionists. How about coercives? I mean, I'd be glad to. I'll brainstorm on some other labels, Joe.
Yes.
The other team, the Washington Generals. But it's consistent with how they try to shut down debate in all the other spaces. They, you know, penalize and ostracize academics that don't toe the party line. You know, they won't engage in any kind of public debate. Bloomberg famously refuses to meet with any of the leading scientists in nicotine science. I mean, that is all of a piece.
And on that point, because I was going through my head, I do think that our only path forward that is forward is something that breaks down those walls and gets people bridging and talking across difference, right? That's the only, like, one of my lines.
I wish for that too, Joe. My hope for that is as fervent as yours. I beg you to believe me. But I have to say, I see so little evidence of it.
Well, so what then? Then I think, and maybe we can find a separate time to do some more post-mortem on your other outreaches and why things have not gone better. And I don't mean to tell you your business and, you know, what works in other things and that sort of jazz. And it's not like I have some magical powder that I'm just storing up to release at just the right moment. But the we are, I think Jonathan Haidt's line is, we evolve to be argument winners, not truth seekers. And the problem is when an argument isn't even happening. And that's what I think. I
agree.
Well,
that's why it's so baffling that the podcast hosts, I mean, they're on a publicity tour for their podcast. They're saying yes to every venue, large and small, that wants to talk about their show. Hell's bells, we'd be glad to promote it and put the links and tout it as much as you like, and yet they won't dialogue with us.
You know, the irony is that this is going to sound not as generous as I would like to be seen as, but you could say, hey, if you want to have the health community really start drumming up interest in your podcast, come on our podcast and then say how biased and awful it was that you went on this AVM one, and the only way to balance it out is to come onto theirs, or to criticize them for having done so. Whatever you do, let's Streisand affect this thing as best we can.
Sure. Or hey, deliver some mic drops and admonitions on, big bad nicotine tobacco flack Jim McCarthy. That'd energize the folks, I'm sure.
Oh boy.
Well, I'd like nothing more than it, Joe. And I think the conversation you and I've had just now for the last hour, we're going to wrap up now, is good proof that those conversations can be had. As you point out, you and I are, poles apart probably on our, political preferences and outlook on 1,000 other issues, and yet I look forward to every time I get the chance to chat with you.
Same.
And I think
Same.
it's thoughtful for the listeners, and it shines light on corners. You said many a thing in this last hour that I hadn't considered about the podcast, and I hope I shed some light too. So it's hard. This convo itself, I think, is good proof that kind of dialogue can happen, even if you and I are aligned on this issue, broadly speaking.
No, amen.
And that leads to the idea that Joe and I had, which is perhaps doing a part 2 of this conversation. There's a lot of thread we left on the cutting room floor. Again, it's an 8-hour podcast, and there's a lot more to chew over. And we're also going to try to invite some other leading voices in the vape stakeholder community to join in this series we're going to do about the Backfired podcast. And maybe we'll even do it as a group, and we can build 3 or 4 bridges, Joe, instead of just one.
Love the bridge building.
So the conversation is to be continued.
Wonderful. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, that sounds good, Joe. Yes, and I'll end with the last thing we say at Blessed Sacrament, which is peace be with you.
And with you.
All right, sounds good, Joe. Talk soon. Thanks for listening, everybody.
We'll
be back with more Shaping Vaping.